Hello, this is Neelkamal Soares. I'm a developmental behavioral pediatrician at Western Michigan University Homer Stryker MD School of Medicine in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And this is Module 12, Emerging Topics, and this is part one of a two-part series. And this one deals with portable and wearable technology for persons with disabilities. This lecture is part of the Michigan LEND training program. Michigan LEND is funded under the Autism CARES Act administered by HRSA's Maternal Child Health Bureau. And out of Wayne State University, including the 6 universities across Michigan. I have no financial conflicts of interest to disclose related to this presentation. This webinar presentation is for educational purposes only and does not constitute medical advice. And technology is continuously evolving, and what I'm talking about now is only as good as now. And by the time you view this in spring of 2018, a lot of things could be new, different, new cutting-edge technology. So stay on top of what's going on with technology if you want to be completely up to date. The objectives at the conclusion of this presentation, I hope that you'll be able to describe some innovative technology solutions available to individuals with disabilities to advance and support healthcare and apply strategies, including the user experience when providing technology solutions for children with disabilities. So we'll talk about the user experience and go through some of these solutions, and hopefully you will understand it well enough that when it comes time for your assignment, you will feel more comfortable. So children with disabilities is actually the largest minority group if you consider them a minority group per se. Almost 19% of the U.S. population is identified as having a disability, and 1 in 6 children in the U.S., according to CDC data, has a developmental disability, which has increased about 17% in the decade ending in 2008. New data will come out till 2017, 2018, and we shall see where that goes. But over the last 10, 12 years, the prevalence of autism spectrum disorders has increased almost 300%, and ADHD 33%, but hearing loss has decreased about 31%. So not all disabilities are going in an upward trajectory. The CDC data also shows that males have twice the prevalence, particularly in relations to attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, autism spectrum disorder, and learning disabilities. Hispanic children had a lower prevalence, and it's unclear whether that's a function of less identification, less diagnostics based on access to care. Children insured by Medicaid had a twofold higher prevalence of any disability compared to private insurance, and those who were below the federal poverty line had a higher prevalence of developmental disabilities. So Arthur C. Clarke famously said, any sufficiently advanced technology is equivalent to magic. And certainly in our lifetimes, we have seen this exponential growth in technology adoption and penetration in human life. It's the most rapidly evolving field. Technologies have become more affordable, portable, easier to use and maintain. And every 30 years or so, a new technology comes along that transforms society. You could argue that plastics and healthcare, medicines, pharmaceuticals were there in the first half of the 20th century. Then it became electronics, energy. More recently, it's information technology, and it's going to evolve. And the new darling is biologicals, biotechnology, and genetics. When we talk about technology and disabilities, I want to quickly mention assistive technology, or AT. And the reason is, in this presentation, we won't be specifically talking about assistive technology. Some of you are familiar with those in either the fields you deal with, whether you're a family member or a provider or a student. You know about speech-generating devices for people with communication disorders or equipment for people with motor disabilities. But but we're going to talk about commercially available technology. But as far as we're concerned, AT is any piece of equipment or product which is modified or customized, used to, or commercially available off the shelf, used to increase, maintain, or improve functional capabilities of individuals with disabilities. And the AT service is that which uses an AT device. And generally, AT is directed at a selected population who would benefit for specific functional impairment. And we're going to look very broadly at devices that are commercially available that aren't targeted to any one group of individuals with a disability. Technology certainly has the potential to benefit people with disabilities, whether it's in work, education, or social relationships. They overcome barriers of distance, of transportation, of specific deficits. Smartphones, as you know, have revolutionized the world, but they're also very helpful for those with communication and hearing impairments. They can use them to communicate more efficiently. People can use avatars and be in, online living spaces, if you will, and can live their lives through different personas, just like people without disabilities. You can't tell by looking at somebody's avatar or chat room communications whether they have a disability or not. The internet offers innumerable ways to pursue education, employment, and we know that people with disabilities have anyway struggled with employment levels compared to those without, and this is offering people the chance to sort of level the playing field. It's still not quite there, as we'll see. So smartphones and tablets. Smartphones have been adopted faster than any new technology in the history of mankind. There are over 2 billion worldwide, and 81% of all mobile users have, by the end of 2016, so by now it's probably even higher, have adopted smartphones. You can't talk about smartphones without talking about the app. And some people don't know that app is just short form for mobile application. It's just the software which runs on these devices. More and more with tablets and smartphones, you can have other things that are linked. Keyboards can be linked, game controllers, smart watches, fitness monitors, and these devices can be used from everything from making social connections, accessing information, navigation, organizers like, calendars and reminders and GPSs and media recorders and players. They have killed off so many other devices. It's amazing what one little thing can do. And there's a lot more already out there that I'm probably not mentioning, and more to come. Some examples of where apps are used with people with communication disabilities. So voice recognition. I know professionals use Dragon, but non-professionals can use it too, a voice recognition app that pretty much can speak and converts it into text and email messages. Speak It To Me is a way to have information translated back to you. Text to voice pretty much has had emails and documents, web pages, etc. spoken back to the user. Talkulator is a talking calculator. Articulation Station helps with sound finding in those who have articulation difficulties. Rocket Keys can have a talking keyboard. So there are many, many ways apps can help. Other types of disabilities, you've got social skills apps like SOSH, organizational apps, sequence of events for people, for example, with ASD, have like a picture sequence, visual schedules. Scatterbrain takes notes, home routines gives reminders. There are lots of things out there. Again, these are just some examples. There are a lot more. I tried to find ones that are free and are in the app stores. Wearable technologies, there are more things that you put on your wrist or put on your upper arm or put in your pocket. They can track your daily activities. Fitbits and Apple Watches are some examples. So people with disabilities are at a higher risk for various chronic diseases, including diabetes, hypertension, obesity. And some of the apps with these wearable devices not only collect the data, but allow you to connect with other people. And you can have online communities which can share information as they see fit and compete with one another or collaborate with one another. That keeps motivation up. Smart devices also very helpful, where you have wearables like hearing aids, and you can have your smartphone or your smartwatch control settings and help collect data. Now you might argue, okay, so I can have my Fitbit or my Apple Watch tell me about my steps, and what about wheelchair users? And there are actually apps with this Apple Watch or something called the Fitbit Flex that can count how much distance or how many arm rotations are used by wheelchair users. And Ohio State University actually had a little device that fits between the frame of the wheelchair and the wheel that counts the revolutions and can be downloaded. So cannot exclude people, even in wheelchairs, from fitness activities. There are new technologies out there, and some of these really blow my mind. You've got people with visual impairments who can use their scanners on their Apple devices to read barcodes, UPC codes, etc., and read labels. You've got something called refreshable braille displays, or Braille displays, to pronounce it correctly. It's Louis Braille. Converts words and images from a web page into a digital version of Braille, and they have these rows of cells that line up, and every time you finish one, it refreshes, put another one. So it's very versatile. You've got little finger readers that you run across any text, and it converts it into audio. So basically, it's got a couple of motors and uses a camera and software to process the video of the images as you move from left to right. And you have mobile American Sign Language devices that helps people use mobile video to communicate, especially helpful for hearing impaired people. So there's a lot out there. Some of these are not really universally available or universally known. Some like these aren't apps, but separate standalone devices. But just to know that technology exists out there that does a lot of things that we wouldn't think possible. Virtual reality is really where it's at in the future. It creates an experience that simulates, an actual experience. It's used for gaming a lot, but more and more it's being used in community activities and education. And it helps people with physical and communication and cognitive disabilities overcome barriers, travel barriers, if they want to get into real life situations. So when, for example, you want to take people on community shopping outings or social interaction, that allows them to do this safely and in protected environments for practice. Use of VR in the classroom can help different students progress through their sort of curricula at their own pace, and allows for active participation, and it's really motivating. Exercise for people with disabilities is really motivating when they do it in a virtual reality space. Now, again, these are still not universally available. Some companies are producing technologies. They tend to be very expensive, but I just wanted you to see what's out there. Safety is a big deal. Individuals with disabilities find themselves in situations where safety could be impaired. And to understand this, you have to understand what sensors are. And sensors are small devices that collect data. They could be biological data, chemical data, or physical data. So sensors are used in the field to detect earthquakes, to detect pollution, to detect air quality, and it sends it remotely so somebody can collect this data. And this same type of sensor information can be used in the home, let's say, of a person with a developmental disability who needs community living and doesn't appreciate having a sitter there all the time, or somebody continuously watching them by cameras. They could be put in, and we'll talk about that in a second, and this can reduce costs and manpower and help people feel a little more independent. The other situation is seen in people with Alzheimer's, but also in people with autism spectrum disorder, where they leave an area without permission or notification. This can put them at risk. And elopement happens in a lot of people, especially with communication impairments. And you can imagine the safety issue where somebody is wandering and has no ability to communicate their name or their address or phone number or a contact information. So for this type of remote monitoring, if you want to live in place as you will or live independently, you've got motion sensors in the rooms. You've got, a camera facing the door so you can detect if somebody's trespassing or entering. They have interactive audio videos so you can communicate with your care worker. People with chronic conditions can have sensors on their medication bottle cap so you can tell how often it was opened, whether the medication was taken on time. You can have Bluetooth scales which send information about your weight. If you have heart failure and you have an increase in weight, it can alert your care team. Your blood sugar device, your asthma peak flow meter, all of these have abilities to transmit data. And we'll be talking about telehealth and remote patient monitoring in the next section of this module in a separate presentation, but these are some examples. Shock sensors in the floor, if somebody falls, can detect if somebody fell or furniture fell over. And there are sensors that detect sound levels. So people who have communication and volume difficulties, it can sort of help them understand how to modulate. There's tons of stuff out there. It's just a question of how affordable and accessible they are, how aware the client and the provider is, and what can be done to connect them, and what's really the use case. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. For wandering, for people with autism spectrum disorder, you have GPS and other types of RFID or radio frequency identification type of devices, things that can be clipped on or worn, and the app or the tracking system gets alerts if the person's not where they're supposed to be. It can connect with public safety officials to track a person. It can be a wristband, a key fob, a clip-on. There are lots of things, and this really has been very helpful for some families to identify when a child or an adult is eloping or is missing. But technology is not always that inclusive. It also excludes persons with disabilities. Even though the internet is out there and available, the usage of the internet and related technologies by people with disabilities is much less than the rest of the population. And part of this has to do with interfaces and access. And, an amazing thing is even though there are laws which talks about internet-related technology should be accessible, even the U.S. government's websites, 90% of them had access barriers. And the law that went into place was supposed to promote access to internet services, mobile devices, and require things like closed captioning, video description, emergency information accessible. But there are also workarounds, and we'll talk about that. And this has prevented there from being universal accessibility to telecommunication technologies. Some of the reasons why technologies are inaccessible, for example, if you have a smartphone and the phone is difficult to see by somebody with visual impairments, well, you can't really see the web content without screen readers and magnification. People with motor impairments, how are they supposed to navigate these very small buttons as people try and make devices smaller and smaller? The buttons and the access gets smaller. The layout gets more cluttered. How is somebody with motor impairment supposed to navigate that? What if they require a pointing device or a head switch? How are they going to access? People with hearing impairments, when there's audio content, when there's interactive web content and chat features, how are they supposed to access that? What are the textual equivalents? Same thing with communication impairments. Design, are these things designed to be accessible to people with cognitive impairments? What about people with learning disabilities and reading issues? Seizure disorders, if there's rapid flickering and flashing of display displays, this can actually trigger a seizure and jeopardize their health. So we've got to think about what's out there and how accessible it is, or how things we take for granted could actually be a barrier to accessibility for people with disabilities. What things that we can do? Yeah, there are many things we can do and things that are being done. So a screen reader provides the computer synthesized speech of whatever visual output is there. It's almost like a reader. And speech recognition allows for people to input content who may have motor difficulties. There are alternative keyboards, there are haptic things which go by touch, pointing devices. So there are assistive technology devices out there and guidelines, but it all depends on the website, because it's really how the website is designed. If a website is designed for accessibility, then you need very little to do to have a successful interaction. But if it isn't, there's nothing you can do with add-on devices that's going to help, because the inherent code that it's written in may be written in a way that is not amenable to adaptations. So a great example is something as simple as the program which opens up a document. And there's something called Flash technology, and not to pick on a company, but Adobe Flash is much less accessible than straight up HTML programming. And so if a web page is in Flash, there's nothing you can do to make it accessible as compared to if it was in HTML. So it's really whether designers and hosting sites really have accessible content to begin with. That being said, a lot is being done. Developers, programmers, and device manufacturers have been really thinking about accessibility features. So a great example is, the iPhone now is bigger. Now, it's bigger, but it may be too big for some people with fine motor control issues or holding issues, but it's better for visual issues and people who have bigger icons they can tap on. There are Bluetooth connected Braille keyboards out there. Now, instead of scrolling, you can double tap things. There are many inbuilt features that people are not aware of in smart devices. There are also apps that will read aloud that you can tap on. There are apps where you can take a picture of a color and it'll name it for you. Take a picture or a location and it describes where you're at. So it really, there are things out there that have made the world more accessible. And we should be aware of that, and we should advocate for using it or accessing it. There are really cool things out there that aren't mainstream yet, but you should be aware of. The eye gaze edge tablet, it's not in universal production, but it has been developed, where it really tracks your eye gaze and helps you operate different aspects on your display. The head mouse nano tracks a reflective dot on the user's forehead to control the cursor. These are, again, examples of technology advancements that are helping with accessibility. There's really some next-gen cool stuff. Smart glasses which accentuate the contrast between light and dark and help visually impaired people at least see outline shapes and some details. So an example on that upper right-hand image is one using the smart glasses and can show at least the outline you can see of a lady sitting at a table with things behind her. Sensors in a glove can help convert tracings into computer text and help deafblind people operate computers. Again, a lot of cutting edge stuff, not ready for prime time and universal access, but something you should know that there are people out there who take very seriously accessibility for people with disabilities. Now, we talked about laws and we talked about regulations, and one of the things you need to know about is Section 508. So you're probably familiar with Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, which is implemented in educational and workplace situations, supposed to make accommodations for people with disabilities, comes up pretty often in people with healthcare needs like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, diabetes, cystic fibrosis, etc., in school environments. Section 508 required federal agencies to make their electronic and information technology accessible to people with disabilities. And even though it's a 20-year-old law, in 2017 it was updated because of this explosion in devices and content beyond just websites. So now it applies to electronic documents and software. It applies to mobile devices, cell phones, computers, hardware and software, media players. And so in addition to this federal law, there are states like Maryland and California which have passed their own accessibility laws. However, there's a drawback, is that implementation is not there. There's no enforcement agency per se. So the burden of proving and bringing complaints against agencies and companies which violate this law is on the people with disabilities themselves. And their chances of winning these complaints or lawsuits is low because there are workarounds, as I talked about, as a company or an agency can claim that the accommodation is not financially or practical, feasible or reasonable, and it places an undue burden on them, and that is an exemption, an undue burden exemption. So, there are things out there to protect clients with disabilities, but there are also things that, again, impede accessibility and the very laws that have been created to enhance accessibility. We've got to go back to designing these things. So it's not good enough to talk about the device and what can we do to make sure that somebody with a disability can access the device. That's assuming that the device is made a certain way for everyone and people with disabilities have to adapt to it. So a lot of laws focus on the technologies and not the users or why they use it. And so universal design states that the design is for everyone, not just for quote-unquote regular people, but it's to be usable by all people of all ages, of all abilities. And this is really important because it's critical in when you're having a rapidly evolving set of technologies, like what we're currently experiencing. Sometimes when something moves to the next iteration or phase, it further excludes, because if you're going to design things that require adaptations, a person with a disability gets an adaptation to, let's say, an older version of a smartphone, and the phone evolves, and the adaptation now is not kept up with the new operating system. Well, now they're going to be further behind. So universal design is important because by doing it right the first way, originally, it reduces the need of finding financing and doing things to access these technologies and these services. And so it's best to do it from the start. And people talk about rehabilitation engineering, which looks at human performance and how people interact with their environments, and talks about designing interfaces that are used by a wide variety of people. And so bridging the gap between what users know and what they need to know is important. There should be no disparities in access and disability, gender, literacy, culture, etc. And so universal accessibility is really, universal usability, as I say, is really important. I like this image from Warburg, and it talks about, if you look at a user needing to fit into a system, and then, okay, we have to have an adaptation for somebody with a disability to adapt to the system. But what if you made the system flexible? So it doesn't matter what sort of user interacts with it. And that's really what we need to look at, this ability-based designing. And you might wonder, why do we need to talk about this? Well, we should advise and engage people who build systems and who build technologies to be flexible in their thinking, because that helps our clients and our patients and the people we live with and work with. So there are best practices out there. The Federal Communications Commission developed best practices in conjunction with stakeholders and talked about being informed, understanding, and including people with disabilities in product design and product development, letting the designers and the developers know more about people with disabilities and what they need to have, and have this information available, user instructions and guides, make them available and have features that are personalized and customizable. So there are best practices, but again, these are best practices. These are not laws. These are not enforced. It requires the companies and developers and the users to be aware and engage in these discussions. What should we be doing? We're consumers, but we're also educators, right? And so we should let, as I'm letting you know, let our trainees know about what's out there and what accessibility and design needs to involve. We should be advocates for our families. We all are, whether you're a family advocate and a member of a family, or whether you're a healthcare provider or a other clinician. Really help families understand ways to engage tech, what technologies are out there, what things are usable, what things they can have input in. We should be open about using tech ourselves, using these apps, knowing what they are, test drive them with an eye to being part of this interdisciplinary team, basically partnering with technology specialists, doing research. It'd be great to have people conduct research in technology accessibility. And the LEND is a great way to involve interdisciplinary teams because we're all from different disciplines, and so we should think about engaging in teams to address these issues. So a really important thing is to understand this matrix. It's called the user honeycomb or the user experience honeycomb. It's from Peter Morville. And the reason I find this helpful, even though it looks very confusing, is to understand what these terms mean, because this can be helpful in deciding what the user gets out of working with technology. So if we go from the top and go in a downward fashion. So useful. Is the product or system useful to the client? Is it usable? Can the client find it easy to use? Is it desirable? Is it something the client actually wants? Is it findable? You could have a wonderful thing that's useful, it's usable, they want it, but can they find it? Do they find it valuable? Is there value in the amount of effort and time and money spent to get it, to acquire this? Do they find it valuable? Is it accessible? Once they have it and they find it valuable, can they actually interact with it? And then finally, is it credible? Do they trust it? Do they trust it does what it's supposed to use? So, supposed to do. So, think about this. You will need this when you do your activity, but just it's a nice framework of looking at it from the user's perspective. Always think about what is it that the client needs, and is what I'm offering or is what's out there fitting into this matrix. This has been a fun presentation to put together. I learned a lot. I hope you did too. And I look forward to having this discussion at our Zoom session. The one thing I will leave you with is that technology does not rule us. No matter how much technology makes our lives better, the human spirit must always prevail. And that's from no less a person than Albert Einstein. Thank you.